So my name is Layla Elmus and I'm a historian at the City of Sydney. On behalf of the city's history team, I'd like to acknowledge that we are living, working and creating on country, on the lands of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples. We pay our sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging. And now I'd like to present our speaker, Dr. Lisa Murray. Lisa Murray is the city historian, and recently she's been delving into our oral history collection to find for you some snippets of first-hand testimonies that show the way that people, particularly Sydney-siders, have coped in the past with events similar to what we're living through. In particular, she's looking at the Great Depression of the 1930s. Her talk is titled Sugar Bags and Specked Fruit, Memories of the Great Depression. Lisa, take it away.
Thanks, Layla, and hello to everyone. Along with Layla, I'd like to extend my respects to Aboriginal people and elders past, present and future. I'm coming to you from Gadigal and Wangal land as well. And I think it's important we always remember that we live and learn together on country as Aboriginal people have done for thousands of years. So, I think we're living through interesting times, and the economic recession that we are currently experiencing because of the pandemic has been compared to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So I think it's worthwhile to reflect upon how people experience this economic and social upheaval. And consequently, I've been delving into our oral history collection, where we have many recordings of people remembering their childhood and reflecting upon the poverty and survival strategies of the 1930s. But first, a quick recap. What was the Great Depression? The global recession, popularly referred to as the Great Depression, was triggered by a sudden stock market crash in the United States of America in October of 1929. The stock market crash led to a massive decline in global trade, and few nations escaped the impact of the depression. Australia, of course, was no exception. And our primary exports halved between 1929 and 1933, and the level of unemployment rose dramatically. But it's fair to say that many people in Australia were already struggling through the 1920s. Our economy had been faltering really since about 1926. So in September of 1929, which is just before the stock market crashed in America, in Australia we had 12.1% unemployment across the nation. So after the stock market crash, the unemployment figure kept rising until 1932, when it peaked at just over 30%, and that's the national figure. When we look back at the impacts of the Great Depression, we see that it was many of the inner city areas, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, that were hardest hit, with unemployment rates much higher than the national average. Places like Alexandria, Erskineville, Redfern, Darlington and Glebe all had rates above 35%. These were working class areas where poverty was the reality through much of the 1920s, and unemployment continued right through the next decade in the 1930s. So let's hear what this had, what sort of impact this had on people living in the inner city. Billy Pascoe was born in 1911 and grew up in Woolloomooloo. He remembers as a teenager in the 1920s that it was impossible to get a job. He went to the country in search of work, but it was hard, cold, with lots of tramping, and he eventually came back to the city where at least he could rely on charities to get a meal. Here's Billy.
From the 20s up to 1932, it was impossible to get a job. Impossible. I had to leave home when I was 16 because if your father was working, you couldn't get the dough. So I went bush, like all hundreds went bush. just about up there. But the dole was 6 shillings and 6pence a week, 13 shillings a fortnight. That's what you had to live on. You just can't imagine, or taking 6 and 6 them days to what would be these days, would it be?
65 cents.
Eh? Well, it wouldn't be $10 anyway.
No.
And that's what you had to live on, 6 shillings and 6pence a week. That's for your rent and your food. And
so you would have left home in...
28.
Yeah, 16.
27, 28.
Did you go up the country for long?
Yeah, no. The work's up there. At least you get a feed down here. Because then, when you was on the dole there, you had to be in, say you had to be in Cowra today, then you had to be in the next town another 25, next to the next dole day, you had to be in the next town, roughly be about 25 miles, something like that. And you walked it, but there was no such thing as motor cars and anything like that. There was horses and things like that. But you just walked it, and then you walked in that town, then you walked to another town. Just after about 6 months, and it got very, very cold up there. That's what drove you back to Sydney.
Some families could not even afford to pay rent. Jane Lanion grew up in Chippendale, and she remembers her family being unable to pay the rent several times, and so the family would do a runner in the middle of the night to avoid the bailiffs. This was known as the midnight shift, a midnight flit.
Jane, you were talking about the midnight flits.
Yeah, well, that was quite common when the Depression was on, because if you couldn't pay your rent, the landlords would send a bailiff, and he would sit in the house and sell whatever things you went, furniture or etc. in the house, until he got the rent that was owing. And that's why a lot of people did the midnight flit, take their few possessions to the next house. There was a lot of empty houses around at that time, and that's what's known as the midnight flit, you know.
Would you just squat in the houses that you went to, or you had...
Oh, no, you paid rent, you know, because you could only pay rent for so long, because there was no money coming in. But after a while, my father, he was only a builder's labourer, and he got a job building one, I think it was Hurstville School, and with his money and my 7 and 6 a week being apprentice, because the rents weren't very dear, you know, and that was all right. But
communities banded together to assist people with their rent. Groups would fundraise with raffles and concerts, and the Unemployed Workers Union barricaded some houses to stop the bailiffs and police reclaiming property. Frank Oltoft remembers how important the local council was in supporting the unemployed. In Newtown, the Mayor Lillian Fowler was a staunch supporter of the local community. In this excerpt, Frank Oltoft talks about picking up the dole at Wharf 7 down at Circular Quay and relying on food relief from the Benevolent Society. He also refers to relief work offered by local councils.
See, people couldn't afford to pay, you didn't have the money. What happened was that you got your dole, which was 7 and 6 a week, and you get 13 loaves of bread for the fortnight. You'd have to go down to 7 Circular Quay, pick up 13 loaves of bread, and that had to last you the 2 weeks. And then you go to the Benevolent Society in Thomas Street, and you get bacon bones or that, maybe give you soup or whatever you could make of them, and you get the dole at St George's Hall, the St George's Dance Hall, which is just down in King Street there, and the people there were very quite a lot of people on the dole. It was, and not only was it that sometimes you got 2 weeks in 5 relief work, and you used to have to go out to Concord where they had the swamps out there, and you dug and made the walls and stopped the swampland and coming in.
The state government granted money to local councils to subsidise relief work. Council relief work in the 1930s commonly involved beautification programs such as reclaiming wetlands and turning them into parks and road construction. So, for example, in the city, the pool of reflection in front of the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park was built by relief work labour. The lakes in Centennial Park were constructed at the same time using unemployed labour. And Baptist Street was reconstructed by Redfern Council using unemployed labour. Many interviewees refer to the dole in the 1930s, but it is difficult, it's different to what we understand it today. Originally, government welfare relief was distributed through food and then food coupons or vouchers. It was only later that a payment was introduced, and the payment rate varied across the states in Australia. Now, you might have heard Frank Althoff then referring to the Benevolent Society. The Benevolent Society and other secular and religious charities were vital support for inner city families. As Frank noted, the Benevolent Society was located in Thomas Street, which, if you can see my cursor there, I'm just circling around the Benevolent Society location now. And it was in a very important location. It was located right near Central Railway Station and also right near the vegetable markets up the top of the map here. And many families and people walked between the wharves, the markets and the Benevolent Society in search of sustenance. Molly Peele recalls her father traipsing down to Wharf 7 at Circular Quay with a sugar bag to pick up food. Like many families, Molly's parents relied upon food coupons to feed the family. So we're going to listen to Molly. Just a heads up, this is a poor recording and the audio may be difficult to hear, so listen closely.
During the Depression, when it first came in, I can remember my father having to go to Circular Quay with a sugar bag to collect the food that you had there, which was condensed milk and rice and treacle and all that sort of stuff, you know. And I think my mother could do everything with rice.
What did you have to go to Circular Quay for?
Because that's where when it first happened, that's where it was put out. That's where you had to go to have it.
This was distributed food.
Distributor food, where it was distributed. And then they brought in a thing that you got a coupon. You had to go through the government or whatever it was, and you got a coupon. You nominated the shop where you wanted that coupon to send to you, and that's where you went and bought your groceries at that shop. You could go from day to day or whenever until your coupon run out, until the next fortnight until you got one.
The fruit and vegetable markets were a magnet for impoverished families. Let's listen to Jane Lanion again as she talks about how her family scavenged for specked fruit. Sorry, I just got to get...
Were you expected to contribute to the family in any way? You mentioned before going around and scrounging a few things. And was that sort of an expected thing, or was that just what you did?
No, I used to do that with the other kids from the school, you know, where our kids talk at school. But of a Saturday, we used to wheel, my father and my sister and I used to wheel a pram down to Paddy's markets. And come 4 o'clock in the afternoon, like the markets are finished, the vegetable people used to wipe their stalls of the vegetables, and there used to be big heaps of vegetables that would have went to the tip. So we used to go through there and put in the pram what was eatable and what was good. And one time a chap took pity on us and gave us a watermelon, and we got as far as the old Empire Theatre in Quay Street, and my father dropped the watermelon. And of course, rather than waste it, we all sat on the steps of the Empire Picture Show, and with our hands we scooped the watermelon out and ate it. So we weren't going to waste a darn good watermelon because my father was careless, you know. But that's what we used to do for Saturday, go down there, and we used to get as I say, a pram, an old pram filled with groceries or speck fruit, and we used to bring it home, sit at the table, cut the specks out and make fruit salad out of it, you know. Well, that was something for nothing, and just something we used to do, you know.
Betty Moles was born in 1925 and grew up in Alexandria. Her brothers would go to the markets and scrounge specked fruit as well. The enterprising siblings would then sell some of this fruit to the passers-by in their street, Belmont Street in Alexandria, to make a little bit of money.
Were the Depression years hard years? It sounds like you had a little bit of money for the pictures and...
Yeah. Oh, well,
what can you remember of them?
Well, to get the big money that we did have, we used to go and, my brothers used to go and get the fruit and that from the markets, and we used to pick the best of it out and put it on a plank out the front of our house in Belmont Street, and we used to sell it.
The kids would?
Yeah, we'd sell that. We'd sell it to the people in the street for threepence or sixpence or whatever, to get enough money for us all to go to the pictures. And what we had left over went in the bowl for food and that for a mother to keep us going.
And this was the fruit was collected from the...
From the city market. We used to, the fruitman Horace Stubbs used to take my eldest brother down there with him of a morning, and he'd go around collecting all the fruit. It was just dropped, you know, bruised and that sort of thing. And what vegetables was just shot aside, which they didn't think they could sell. He'd pick them up and bring them home in a sugar bag. And we'd take them out and put them on those plank and have them all out the front. And because when one wasn't there, the other brother was there, and when they weren't there, I was there selling the fruit and the vegetables to all the people that come past and wanted to buy them and that. And there used to be a fish shop down the street in Belmont Street. Mrs. Gurney was her name, and we used to go down there and get our fish and scallops and that reasonably cheap, and of a Friday night for tea, and we'd always ask for scraps. And the scraps used to be all of the batter from the fish that was on the top, and you'd often get a couple of good chips in amongst them to eat. And you got those for nothing. We used to say, have you got any scraps, Mrs. Gurney? And she used to give them to us.
Others resorted to petty crime to supplement their family needs. Huey Goodwin was born in 1921 and lived in Piedmont all his life. He acknowledges that he used to steal things as well as go fishing.
How did people help each other, like during the Depression and hard times?
Look, you had to live through it to realise what it was. I was fortunate because we'd go out and we'd pinch a bit of stuff, and we'd go down fishing, get a few fish, and my Uncle Tom lived with us, my mum's brother. He didn't marry, and he used to get a little bit of work because nobody got work. It's very hard for a person to say that they worked right through a depression, and it'd be enough to pay the rent and what my mother could earn, make a dress or two during the depression. And you catch a few fish, and my brother Bill, he was at a workable age, couldn't get work.
Similarly, Sid Fennell euphemistically refers to things that fell off the back of a truck.
As I say, if someone was lucky enough to find something that fell off the back of a truck, he shared it with his neighbour. You know?
Was there a lot of things falling off the backs of trucks in those days?
Yes. Very bumpy roads.
Yeah. A lot of factories.
Factories. Yeah. And there were, what few trucks there were on the road always lost something.
Yeah. People had to get by.
That's right. And they help one another.
Things also miraculously fell off the goods trains during the 1930s. Ned Bottomley tells the story of how frozen meat carcasses were thrown out the carriage to men waiting down in Wentworth Park. Now, the audio quality of this is fairly poor, so listen up. And yes, there are also a few car hoons in the background of this one. So we'll just get that going.
I don't know whether you know where the train goes across at Wentworth Park.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, just before it goes into to come round, and it used to come into Piedmont and go around there. Well, they used to stand there, and somebody would be in there and throw a carcass of meat out the. And that's how you might get that, a couple of times a year, somebody at their game to, yes, it'd be frozen. In fact, I have a friend, he'd only died not long ago, and he was there waiting. He said he was only young, and they threw the meat out, and, being frozen, stiff, and it hit him, and he said he laid there till the next morning unconscious. And he must have had concussion before he woke up where he was with this side of lamb, this lamb hanging on,
That was it during the Depression years?
Yes, during the Depression years, yeah.
The Depression affected every family in the inner city. Life was tough, but many families and communities banded together, sharing food, taking advantage of charity and welfare on offer, and using their connections and wits to get by. Memories of the Great Depression in inner Sydney reveal poverty and hardship, but also a resourcefulness and resilience. I'll give the final word to Sid Fennell, who expresses admiration for the way people socialised and shared.
Was your father out of work in the Depression?
Yeah.
How do you think that affected him?
Oh, it affected everybody in some way, you know what I mean? You couldn't give your family what you would like them to have. And you never had, nobody had anything more than anyone else in those days. If you had a job, from what I can recall, you might have had 1 day, 2 days a week. But you had a lot of friends in those days.
And did people socialise a lot together?
They socialised a lot, and if someone in the street got something that you didn't have, well, you got part of it, If they had a little bit of good fortune to run into something, they shared it. People shared things.
If you've enjoyed listening to these memories, then I encourage you to explore our oral history collection more. You can find many of the interviews in our collection on our specially curated website, sydneyoralhistories.com.au. Thanks for joining us today.